The vice president to Joe Biden, whether it was a male, female, black, white, or anything else, was going to have a giant political albatross around their neck, and they could perform perfectly or perform imperfectly. But that person was going to be at a disadvantage.
She didn't make a good case.
Well,
she didn't denounce the past stuff that people didn't like. She just tried to ignore it. Why you have to make all these excuses for her? This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, "Oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous!" Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things, and I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
Been on that MSNBC, mate. It was propagandist nutcrackery on there. I went on a show called Morning Joe. It was absurd the way they carried on.
Good morning, Joe.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. It wasn't morning. There was no one called Joe there. No one could concentrate. They didn't understand the basic tenets of journalism. No one was willing to stick up for genuine American heroes.
Bill Maher just torched another MSNBC darling, live and unfiltered. The so-called champions of woke righteousness keep showing up to his show like lambs to the slaughter. And Maher, he's not pulling punches, he's throwing haymakers. This latest beatdown, it wasn't just a clash, it was a public intellectual execution. The guest walked in smug and scripted and left visibly rattled, caught in the crossfire of Maher's savage logic and unflinching takedowns. At this rate, MSNBC might want to issue a warning. Enter Maher's arena at your own risk. Because what went down wasn't just a disagreement, it was a televised obliteration. So, who was the unlucky pundit who got grilled to ash this time? What jaw-dropping moment turned the tide and sent social media into a frenzy? We've got the moment that detonated the internet, and trust us, the receipts are nuclear. Buckle up, because what you're about to witness isn't just a debate, it's a reputational bloodbath. Let's break it all down.
Everything the candidates, especially the Democrats, do to get voters annoys them. The constant texting. Did you get the texts from Tim Walz every 5 minutes, and always begging for money and knocking on doors? We've got people knocking on doors. People don't want knocking on your door. Who in this day and age wants someone knocking on? Kids don't even like it when a phone call. That's like too much of a invasion of their privacy.
Bill Maher just wrecked MSNBC's John Heilemann on air, and the hypocrisy couldn't be clearer. Heilemann tried to blame Kamala Harris's flop on a messaging failure, but Maher wasn't buying the spin. It's not the message, it's the medium, Maher fired back. While Democrats clung to safe spaces like MSNBC and CNN, Trump was dominating the real battlefield, podcasts like Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn, where swing voters actually tune in. And when their echo chamber strategy collapsed, Democrats got desperate, spamming voters with texts and even showing up at their doors, crossing every line of personal space. Maher called it what it was: outdated, invasive, and totally disconnected. Heilemann didn't have a defense, just a blank stare as Maher shredded the whole playbook.
Who might emerge as the strongest Democratic opposition leader in the next Trump era? Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, like Adam Schiff, he won, right? Big. And
he won big. I like Westmore.
Westmore's fantastic. He's in Maryland.
Yep.
But who's going to be the one? Gavin Newsom we have here in this state. He's already called the legislature to. Trump hasn't done anything yet, but I understand the.
This was the problem. There was a 2014 study that showed that Fortune 500 companies were more likely to pick a female CEO if the company was struggling, basically setting women up for the big job, but to also fail. If they did well, fine. But if they failed, look, we have a female CEO while failing. And that's what I feel like they did to Kamala Harris.
What is this guy even saying? The narrative from MSNBC's John Heilemann is pure delusion. According to him, all Kamala had to do was echo the Democratic message louder, and magically the voters would fall in line? Wrong. And dangerously out of touch. Here's the reality. Americans weren't waiting for catchy campaign slogans. They were living through chaos. Soaring inflation, violent streets, a border in freefall. This wasn't partisan spin. It was everyday survival. And no amount of polished speeches could drown that out. Voters didn't care about who was delivering the message. They were already rejecting the content. Loudly. Even if Biden had been operating at full cognitive power, it wouldn't have saved him. In fact, it might have made the defeat even uglier, because Americans didn't tune out the person. They tuned out the party. The problem wasn't the amplifier, it was the product, and voters slammed the door shut.
And they set Kamala Harris up to fail. That was a 3-month campaign, and she was supposed to introduce herself to the American people. No wonder people were Googling, did Joe Biden drop out? And so...
No. No. You're saying 3 months wasn't long enough?
It was too long. It was long enough.
It was long enough.
If they had a primary...
It's not that they didn't have time to introduce. They met someone and didn't like them.
Bill Maher nailed it again. The Democrats didn't lose because they lacked talent. They lost because they ignored it. As Michael Douglas bluntly pointed out on the show, the party had a stacked bench. Governors, senators, rising stars, all ready to lead. But instead of choosing strength, they chose symbolism. Why? Because they were obsessed with optics. Identity politics took center stage. Merit was sidelined. Competence got buried under a checklist of race and gender. They didn't pick the most capable candidate, they picked the one they thought looked the part. A calculated move aimed at scoring points with key demographics. But the voters weren't fooled. Representation without results means nothing. Americans weren't asking for tokenism, they were begging for solutions. And when they didn't get them, they walked. The Democrats gambled on image over impact and lost. That performative choice didn't inspire trust. It triggered backlash. And now, they're paying the political price.
You're the sitting vice president, and you get put on elevated to the top of the ticket 107 days ahead of the election. I think that is a very high degree of difficulty put on anybody. And I do not think she is the perfect candidate. I tend to agree with Sarah that probably in a fully litigated primary, she probably would not have been the Democratic nominee, but we'll never know that. But I will tell you that, there's never been anybody who's had the difficulty of that situation, elevated that late in the campaign. Why?
Democrat would have needed to run away from
Bill,
the
I don't know
Biden
if you know this, but the Vice President of the United States is basically shoved in a broom closet for 3.5 years.
I know.
You couldn't.
She was more popular in there.
Yes, well.
I mean, this idea that in a mass media age, that 107 days is not long enough to know somebody?
You are way overestimating the American people in terms of what their ability.
No.
Hold up. Did he really just say that? This right here is the exact elitist arrogance that's driving Americans away from the Democratic Party in droves. MSNBC's John Heilemann actually had the nerve to suggest that Bill Maher was overestimating Americans, just because Maher believed voters could make up their minds in 3 months. Seriously? That's how the woke media sees the rest of us now? Like we're too dim to think for ourselves? No wonder another MSNBC host boldly claimed that Americans don't even know what they want. The disrespect is unreal. Here's the truth. We know exactly what we want, and it's not a hollow puppet doing the bidding of the radical left. It's not fake virtue signaling or condescending lectures. Americans want leaders who actually respect them, who listen, who lead, and who stop pretending we're too clueless to see what's happening in our own neighborhoods. The left can keep underestimating the electorate, but they'll pay for it at the ballot box. Because this time, voters aren't just angry, they're wide awake. Keep the clip rolling, because the backlash is just getting started.
Someone like Donald Trump has become a universally known, understood, loved by some, hated by others over the course of being omnipresent for 8 years.
Okay.
Barack Obama becomes president of the United States after running for 2 years as president, runs a 50-state primary, is on television, does dozens of Democratic debates, and by the time at the end of that, most people knew who he was. Most people.
Yeah.
You drop somebody into the middle of the top of the ticket, 3 days out, 3 months out. You are going to have to spend a lot of time trying to introduce yourself to the country while also being in a steel cage death match with Donald Trump.
Okay, but I don't know if you ever watched this show, but I had Michael Douglas on this week.
Yeah.
At the top, we were talking about this, and he made a very good point that every other country in the world can do it in months, sometimes weeks. Why can every other country do it in that short a period of time? Are they all so much brighter than America? I don't think so.
Exactly. This is the core of the problem, and why the Democrats are spiraling. Other countries can pull off game-changing elections in a matter of weeks. But here, the left acts like voters need a babysitter just to fill out a ballot. Let's be real. This isn't about timing. It's about accountability. The Democrats didn't lose because of a rush decision. They lost because of years of spectacular failure. Americans aren't stupid. They saw through the circus. They lived through the inflation, the open border chaos, the crime waves, and the radical policies that made daily life feel unrecognizable. And here's the brutal truth. It wouldn't have mattered if the Democrats had swapped out Biden for Kamala, Newsom, or Whitmer. The loss was already baked in. Why? Because the rot wasn't isolated to one figure. It was systemic. The entire Democratic agenda felt disconnected, elitist, and out of touch with what real Americans care about. This wasn't just a rejection of Joe Biden. It was a full-blown revolt against an administration that promised progress, but delivered dysfunction. Until the Democrats stop preaching and start listening, they'll keep bleeding support, because the American people are done being talked down to. They're ready to take back control.
I think you can believe that you could have shorter elections in America, but it's not like we don't know. In Britain, for instance, when you have a short election, it's not like you don't know who the leader of the party is for months and years before that.
But you're either the person who's Googling the day before, did Biden drop out, or you know in a week. You know, did anyone in this audience not know enough about Kamala Harris pretty much after a week to make a decision? Yeah, you just people.
How are
It's
you gonna enforce
ridiculous. We just get sicker of them.
Bill Maher finally dropped the hammer, and when it landed, the silence was devastating. John Heilemann strutted in with his usual MSNBC smugness, peddling the tired excuse that Americans just don't know enough about Kamala Harris. But Maher wasn't buying it, and he didn't just argue. He obliterated him with one brutal move. He turned to his live audience, overwhelmingly liberal, and asked the simplest question. How many of you feel you don't know enough about Kamala Harris to decide whether to vote for her? The response? Absolutely nothing. No hands, no voices, just a cold, crushing silence that hit like a freight train. The look on Heilemann's face said it all. Panic, humiliation, and the sinking realization that his talking point just died in front of millions. That silence wasn't empty. It was loud. Loud with clarity. Loud with truth. The audience knew who Kamala Harris was. The voters knew. And that, right there, shattered the entire MSNBC narrative. Heilemann tried to recover, but the damage was done. His argument didn't just fall apart, it disintegrated under the weight of undeniable reality. This wasn't just a debate win for Maher, it was a live, televised reckoning. A moment that exposed the left's desperate denial and laid their delusions bare. The silence, it didn't just end the conversation, it ended the excuse.
Why you have to make all these excuses for her? This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, "Oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous!" Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things, and like I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up. There's some sexism.
I'm not to elect a woman when she's the best candidate that they're offered. That's that simple.
I think they are not. I think they were very unlikely to elect whether the vice president to Joe Biden, who had a
that's it.
Who had
That's what they didn't like.
The vice president to Joe Biden, whether it was a male, female, black, white, or anything else, was going to have a giant political albatross around their neck, and they could perform perfectly or perform imperfectly. But that person was going to be at a disadvantage.
She didn't make a good case.
Well,
she didn't denounce the past stuff that people didn't like. She just tried to ignore
Joe
it.
Biden?
Let's be real. Kamala Harris could have changed the game. If she had broken free from the chokehold of the woke left and injected some real-world grit into Biden's campaign, we might be looking at a very different political map right now. Imagine this. A Kamala who tackled the economy head-on, addressed border chaos with clarity, cracked down on crime, and actually spoke to the crushing cost of living most Americans are battling daily. But instead, she clung to the far-left script, tone-deaf, disconnected, and dripping with elitist talking points. She had a golden opportunity to lead with common sense. Instead, she doubled down on ideological theatrics. Had she pivoted, even slightly, toward the center, she wouldn't just be competitive. She might have been in the White House right now, or at least making Trump sweat. And it's not just Bill Maher calling this out. Russell Brand, yes, the unapologetic comedian turned truth cannon, once torched John Heilemann for his fake moralism and smug hypocrisy. Bottom line, voters were ready for something real. Kamala had the chance to deliver and blew it.
I've been on that MSNBC, mate. It was propagandist nutcrackery on there. I went on a show called Morning Joe. It was absurd the way they carried on.
Good Morning Joe.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. It wasn't morning. There was no one called Joe there. No one could concentrate. They didn't understand the basic tenets of journalism. No one was willing to stick up for genuine American heroes.
Russell Brand was dead on. MSNBC isn't a news outlet anymore. It's a megaphone for the woke agenda. And no matter how many times Bill Maher slaps them with reality, they keep clinging to the same tired narrative. John Heilemann proved it. He didn't show up to debate, he showed up to defend a script. This is the real danger of ideological bubbles. They don't inform, they insulate. And the result? Blind loyalty to a message nobody's buying. Bill Maher isn't just hosting discussions anymore, he's leading autopsies on failed talking points. And if MSNBC keeps sending guests in unarmed, they're going to keep getting humiliated. The takeaway is simple: bring real arguments, or get wrecked on national television. And that wraps today's Takedown. If you were here for the truth bombs, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe for more raw, unfiltered commentary that actually gets it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.